or 9 degrees when I'm asleep and the heater's on, so I don't care. And then it's sunny and clear and 22 or 30 during the day, which honestly here with no wind, with the dry air, it's actually really comfortable.
Yeah. Okay, so we're online, and good morning, everyone. Jordan and I are going to continue with our reading and commentary of Answer to Job with paragraph 556, which is actually the fourth paragraph of Answer to Job, keeping in mind that it follows the numbering of volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. So it's paragraphs 553 to 758 of that volume. But so we're only on the fourth paragraph, and I think Jordan and I still have some chatting to do. Go ahead, Jordan. I cut you off. I just wanted to.
Oh, no. It's comfortable, the weather with all these storms. That it was just amazing to me with the jet stream and low pressure and pulling everything up, that storm, the scale of it going from, Colorado to Mexico all the way up to, New York and Maine. I mean, it's just all the way up.
Yeah.
Band of snow and ice, and record lows in some places, I think in North Texas, and but trees falling and power outages. It's just quite a and it's the second year in a row, so it's kind of starting to be the new norm. I laugh that I think all of the weather reports may have too much historical data in their algorithms, because for the last month and a half they would say high of 39 or 41, and it would be 55. And
yeah. All right, so we are into Answer to Job, and believe it or not, I've already done a 2-hour session this morning.
You're all warmed up, so.
Yep, and I still have a rehearsal to do this afternoon at 5. So I'm glad you're getting a lot out of it, Art. That's terrific. And for those of you who are not familiar with how to join our panel, I want to give the address where you can join us and actually chat with us, or you can just lurk and stay there on YouTube, and you don't have to join us if you don't wish. But we're Jordan and I are having fun until somebody else comes.
And it'll be more fun.
Yeah, and then it'll be more fun. So anyway, thank you, Brandy. I take that as a great compliment. She says, hello, Carl, good day.
Yeah, the mustache is coming in.
Oh, it's long since come in. I have to trim it back. I'm hoping for more gray toward the middle, so it's more realistic. I don't know why I still have a dark stash at my age.
I wonder about the same thing. I mean, maybe it's shielded from the sun. My nose. I don't know. But it's the same thing.
Yeah, something like that. And I think I'm close to 20 years older than Jordan. So. So anyway, but there's the link for the MailChimp, and I am playing Carl Jung in our Confluence this summer in June. If you want to come see me actually try to act like Carl Jung, complete with German accent, that could be fun. And so let me put the link for the Confluence in so that people can get to that if they want. And it's called The Creator's Art. A confluence. I never heard that word until we started to use it, and then everybody's using it for some reason. So it's definitely a collective unconscious deal.
Yeah, I started using it in the 90s in architecture
Oh, you
to
did? Mhm.
to work with form and space to get outside of the people would say form follows function, function follows form. And I'm like, no, it's form function. It's a
Mhm.
confluence of what you can and cannot see. And it's interesting that now it has more applicability here. And I notice it as well, more people saying it. And I don't feel like such a nerd anymore, with that word.
Yeah.
Other ways, I'm still quite that. But
Yeah, I guess I never really noticed it before now, but I'm hearing it every day on the news or someplace these days. Uh, but anyway, this summer I will be playing Dr. Carl Jung in the play that we're going to present as part of the Confluence, which will be on June the 12th, 2022 in Helena, Montana. And then we're doing lots of other things too. It's going to be a very, very powerful experience. And I hope you'll join us and have fun with it.
to be honest, thinking about the word confluence, and I started using it with architecture, with form and space, like the form would ossify between the spaces, like become bone. But honestly, thinking about it, I ripped it from native cultures because when I was dealing with ancient underground and dwellings and the nature of dwelling in my thesis in architecture, which was a house, with the nature of dwelling and the nature of materials together, it was that there was always a special psycho-spiritual thing about native cultures locating sacred places in the crook of a confluence of two rivers.
Mhm.
So it's the coming together in a way.
Yeah,
And that
in this case, it's the coming together of more than 6. It'll be like 40 people.
Mhm.
A lot of us are, let's call us mature, but we all have high psychic energy, which is when it comes together with more than one of us becomes extremely powerful. It's unbelievable. And we're going to be doing it again, just the 6 of us in March, or actually 5 of us, because we're going to rehearse our play again in March. And I'm going to rehearse it today because we have the director in Helena, Montana, and the other 2 major parts in the play live in California. So we're rehearsing on Zoom, but we have to do it physically together sometimes. So that's what we're doing. Okay, I'm going to start. Let's see, with a couple of the last sentences of the previous paragraph.
Good idea.
And then I'll get into paragraph 556. So Dr. Jung was talking about the images which appear in the psyche, and all the rage right now is NFTs. So for young people, if you are into NFTs, and Jordan needs to get into NFTs, I'll tell him all about it. Are you familiar with the idea of an NFT?
Oh, I'm being tutored, as it were.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because your tarot deck is a perfect, our perfect NFT image.
Yeah, total one-off, absolutely rare. So you get if I use the initial self-published edition, there were only 125 of the actual. So
Right.
One of the ones that did have nudity, versus the kidified deck, as we've laughed. It's like it's not really for the kids. That's to get through the bouncer of the parent. So
Right.
parents are the ones that are concerned.
So
But
I
yeah,
definitely think you have potential there.
the rarity is, yeah.
Yeah. And so we're getting into it. Anyway, let's see. So Dr. Jung was talking about images and manipulating images in the psyche, and NFTs are entirely in the psyche, but they have great values. People are paying millions of dollars in Ethereum and other Bitcoin style things to buy them, and it's all imaginary.
Yeah, and what it is.
It's imaginary, and it's in the imaginal world, and they're images, and so that's where I wanted to talk about it. Go ahead, Jordan.
I was going to say that right there with Ethereum, that's where I think the applicability really comes in, because Ethereum was so powerful and is so powerful simply because it's more of an implementation method for buying with NFTs. And it gives, basically, it founds or gives Bitcoin a place to have the rubber meet the road. And that's what the rest of the pieces, the new ones, are doing, is, I mean, trying to compete with Ethereum, because it's kind of Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then there's a lot of the rest, and that's an overgeneralization. I'm no financial advisor. I have people in my family who are, but that's kind of my understanding, is that I kept asking them, what's the basis? What's the basis? We had the gold standard, now we're off the gold standard. The U.S. currency is the strongest currency, and so there's a confidence piece, and it's not going to go away. Every currency is tied to the U.S. dollar except for maybe China's. And so, and in a way, that gives credence to the U.S. dollar. So
well, even China's is dependent upon the U.S. dollar,
well,
because we owe them like $4 trillion.
Yeah. So there's the whole national deficit that, like in the 80s, would be, 100 million, 100 billion, something smaller. And that would prop up interest rates. Now it's not so much attached. Yeah. I mean, they've gone their own ways. But I think that back to Ethereum, it seems to be the implementation method that makes its rarity and drives its value, whereas Bitcoin is more truly abstract and is more about computing power than it is about an actual thing.
Yeah. So
if I'm correct in that, I may be off base there.
One thing about imaginary economics, though, I highly recommend that anybody that's going to get into this read the novel King Rat by James Clavell, which is a course in Economics 101, and basically it's carried on among prisoners in the Japanese prison camp in Changi, Singapore, during World War II, and all the old rules fall away, and a corporal builds an economy based on rats and raising rats. That's why he's called King Rat, and so he becomes the most wealthy person in the prison camp, and among other things, he owns a Ronson lighter that's worth $10,000 in those days, which is a lot of money in those days. But the day World War II ended and he's getting on the truck to go back to the U.S. after being liberated from this prison camp, he's back to being a corporal, and the economy has disappeared entirely. Rats are back to being rats, and so on. All right, going on with
that. Actually, that's a perfect example. Really, it really resonates, because there's the perceived value and the confidence of an actuality of value in context, in situ. But then when you put it somewhere else, it doesn't work. I mean, so it's how to, I think it's a wonderful metaphor of how to adapt.
Yeah, and I think it's important because in Jung's time, when he was writing this book 70 years ago, he was having trouble getting people to understand the imaginal world, and that it is real, okay, that it is very real. And he actually has to say that explicitly here in paragraph 751 of this book. He says, what people can't understand is I believe the psyche is real, and others can't get their mind around it. They think they have to have something solid to. But I think these days people understand that there are things that are in the imagination, and that they have value, and that they can move worlds and all sorts of things.
And they find out that I think that too much empiricism, too much, explaining, a lot of over explaining is really just a symptom of abandonment. It's like trying to prove to parents, that you have value, which comes back to Ethereum and comes back to King Rat. And whereas these imaginal pieces actually make sure that the heart of the matter, something that's worthwhile in your life, is actually continued to be included as the nucleus and driver of the empirical actions, etc.
Right. All right. And so I'm going to start in the middle of paragraph 555 and read through 556. So this will be a reading picking up at the bottom of page XIV of the sort of Jung's introduction, which we'll finish today. Okay. He says, after all, we can imagine God as an eternally flowing current of vital energy that endlessly changes shape, just as easily as we can imagine him as an eternally unmoved, unchangeable essence. Our reason is sure only of one thing. A reason, so this is the logos, is sure of only one thing, that it manipulates images and ideas which are dependent on human imagination and its temporal and local conditions, and which have therefore changed innumerable times in the course of their long history. There is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles or archetypes. Something like politics in the United States.
Good point.
These, like the psyche itself, are like matter, are unknowable as such. All we can do is construct models of them, which we know to be inadequate, a fact which is confirmed again and again by religious statements. Okay, so that's the end of 556. And when he says like matter are unknowable, obviously when we look at a book, let's say, it feels quite hard and substantive, but in actual point of fact, it's just filled with little electrons floating around. If you go back down to, the subatomic level, it's not a book at all.
Yeah.
And so, all right.
Well, I start to wonder about the clutter of book piles on my desk when, I'm going to, read the book on this thing,
Right.
And it's interesting to me that I just looked at the pile and went, okay, there's one book besides what I'm writing on my laptop, but I don't notice a dent in the pile of books yet, but the fact that it's going that direction also.
Well, I have to have a solid book.
Yeah, I prefer it.
I mean, maybe this isn't real, and it's only the electrons that are real, and I can abracadabra, I can make it disappear.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Right,
They're
right.
good in your background. I laugh that someone's like, well, you can mark up the PDFs and like, right. And
Right.
when it crashes, all my markups disappear. I I used to joke
Okay.
in architecture that I never broke my nose because my desk just disappeared out from under me when I was drawing and I didn't fall on the floor. But that was
Right.
like what a computer crash was like.
Right. So moving on now, paragraph 456. If
556. Yeah.
556, 556 of Answer to Job. If therefore, in what follows, I concern myself with those metaphysical, quote unquote, metaphysical objects, I am quite conscious that I am moving in a world of images and that none of my reflections touches the essence of the unknowable. I am also too well aware of how limited are our powers of conception, to say nothing of the feebleness and poverty of language, to imagine that my remarks mean anything more in principle than what a primitive man means when he conceives of his God as a hare or a snake. But although our whole world of religious ideas consists of anthropomorphic images that could never stand up to rational criticism, we should never forget that they are based on numerous archetypes, i.e., on an emotional foundation which is unassailable by reason. We are dealing with psychic facts which logic can overlook but not eliminate. In this connection, Tertullian has already appealed quite rightly to the testimony of the soul. In his De Testimonio Animae, he says, quote, and this is a quote from Tertullian, these testimonies of the soul are as simple as they are true, as obvious as they are simple, as common as they are obvious, as natural as they are common, as divine as they are natural. I think that they cannot appear to anyone to be trifling and ridiculous if he considers the majesty of nature, whence the authority of the soul is derived. What you allow to the mistress, you will assign to the disciple. Nature is the mistress, the soul is the disciple. What the one has taught or the other has learned has been delivered to them by God, who is in truth the master even of the mistress herself. What notion of the soul is able to conceive of her first teacher is in your power to judge from what that soul, which is in you, feel that which causes you to feel, think upon that which is in forebodings your prophet, in omens your augur, in the events which befall you your foreseer. Strange if, being given by God, she knows how to act, the diviner for men. Equally strange if she knows him by whom she has been given. So that was Tertullian. Jordan, you want to comment on this?
All through this, the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth is reminding me of how we make distinctions. And just a simple quote from, I think, Croce, Croce, in the 14th century. And I think if I remember it correctly, if man were not dissimilar, if man were not similar, man could not discern man from beast. If man were not dissimilar, man could not discern man from man. So to upgrade that, person to person, but that there's a distinction then between what is a person and what is nature. And the thing is, we are nature. I mean, we all know that, but so there's just that back and forth tennis match of, that as he mentions, as obvious as they are simple, as common as they are obvious, natural as they are common. He's playing a kind of a tennis match back and forth of of matter and things that aren't matter. The obvious and the not obvious kind of thing. So that I feel like Jung. Go ahead.
I think most people know that I admire the work of Jackson Pollock, and I never could understand it back when I was trying to be rational about it. And so there's a great line in the movie about Jackson Pollock's life, in which his wife, Lee Krasner, is watching him paint a large painting on the wall. This is before his drip paintings. And she's not seeing any images. She's not seeing an image that she can relate to. And she says, but Jackson, you have to relate back to nature somehow. And Jackson simply responds, I am nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Yeah.
and that's the point. And the point of this paragraph, in other words, is that we're talking about the eros here, the eros and the logos, which I love to, that's my pet drum, I guess, is the distinction between logos and eros. And if you have to physically see it and logic it out, you're not talking about the psyche, and you're only half a person. And this is why we're talking about things like Bitcoin and NFTs today, because they're all in the imaginal realm. But you know, so is money in the bank. We don't have dollar bills very much in banks anymore. It's mainly little green electrons, and we imagine them as dollar bills. But in point of fact, what the banks move around, if you send your mother $100 to get through the week or something, that's all little green electrons in the United States. I don't know what color they are in other countries, but it's all imaginary. And so we're talking about, Dr. Jung was entirely talking about the imaginal world in his career and all his writings. We live in the eros. We do not live in the logos. And so even though we're reading from a book, that book is dead. There is no life in that book until we put meaning into it. Then it has life. Then it has life, and it's of significance to our lives. But that's in the eros. It's not in the logos. Otherwise, like as I say about the Bible's just a black doorstop unless some gifted preacher puts life into it. So Jordan, go ahead.
I was going to say your comment about the interplay between Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, where he ends up with "I am nature," it reminds me of what I realized about abstract expressionism when I was painting in oils. That I always said, well, if I had the capability to video me painting, that should go along with a painting, because the painting is more of a feeling sense, milestone in the moment product of the, beating the drum of hands on the canvas and moving paint around. And then someone would say, well, how can you sell that painting for so much? It only took you 2 hours. I said, no, it took my whole life up to that point. And so there's the piece there where he says, I am nature. I think there's a consummate realization of one of the stages of individuation that we get to, where in a sense the loss of fear is the beginning of wisdom. And so he got out of what he's supposed to do and got into what he must do. That was his natural way.
And speaking of NFTs, I guess I should mention that I too am going to get into this because years ago I started to study calligraphy, and it takes time to become competent in calligraphy. And but starting a couple of years ago, I gave my grandsons calligraphic works that I had completed as their 16th birthday gift, with sort of important quotes from Jung on them. Although this year I decided to use Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. And so I did two calligraphic versions of it. One which has a mistake in it. It has an extra word. And but I'm betting that people will not find that mistake readily. And I'm reminded of, speaking of rarities, okay, so I don't have that many things that I've sold as pieces of art. There are a few out there, and they're, believe it or not, on all continents, except Antarctica, I suppose. So I have sold prints of art that I've done all over the world and given them away in many cases. But I have started to do this calligraphy work again. And so I was reminded of the reverse Jenny in stamp collecting, where
the inverted Jenny.
Yeah, the inverted Jenny, where the post office accidentally printed, I think it's 75 stamps that have the airplane, which is a biplane, upside down. And I looked it up yesterday, and one of these stamps sold recently for $225,000, or $215,000, and a guy had held on to it for many years, but he was 80 and he wanted to cash it in. So
that actually is a really good example, because that's really a devalued number. In the 80s, there was, I think, a time when it may have been 23 million. Stamps have kind of gone by the wayside in terms of the value and popularity. I remember getting a stamp collection appraised, and it was just, the market's down. And the guy was just basically playing the buy low, buy high, don't sell. And he was going to try to scoop up my collection. And the number was so tiny, I had to just sit on the laurels of the sentimental value. But the inverted Jenny it's interesting to track from an NFT perspective and the market perspective. If you look, I think, at the different prices, I don't know if the 23 million was accurate, but it was a 7-figure number. And if I remember correctly, and it's interesting to me that now they're almost towards pieces of paper. That one's a couple $100,000 piece of paper, but only the true rarity.
Piece of paper.
yeah. One basically the stamps that retained their rarity.
Yeah,
that are the only ones of any value almost. And people are like, no, just use them for postage. It's like, whoa. But the thing is, then they're trying to get you to make less of the others to make what they have rare. If they can get you to use them, then there are fewer.
Yeah, right. So anyway, this ultimately, Debbie looked at two versions that I did last week, and my grandson, coming up on 16-year-old grandson's birthday is on the 25th, so I have to get this to him. I did two versions, one with more reds in it and one with more yellows in it. And the one with more reds is the one that has the
extra word,
has the error in it.
Yeah, error.
And so I'm planning to mint that as my first NFT, and
nice.
It'll be rare.
Well, it's interesting. That's a great example, because I remember in architecture, one of my teachers said, well, you have to make sure you put an error in so that you're not competing with God.
Yeah.
And I said, so you're saying it was perfect before? I'll leave it that way.
No, it is perfect. It's perfect both ways, actually.
It is. But I remember backing up one step on his logic and, basically 3-point pinning him down.
Yeah.
But it was both. So,
right. Okay, so we're moving on now. You want to read 557?
Certainly. Paragraph 557. I would go a step further and say that the statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul, even at the risk of being suspected of psychologism. The statements of the conscious mind may easily be snares and delusions, lies, or arbitrary opinions, but this is certainly not true of the statements of the soul. To begin with, they always go over our heads because they point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia, E-N-T-I-A, are the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and they precipitate complexes of ideas in the form of mythological motifs. Ideas of this kind are never invented, but enter the field of inner perception as finished products, for instance, in dreams. They are spontaneous phenomena which are not subject to our will, and we are therefore justified in ascribing to them a certain autonomy. They are to be regarded not only as objects, but as subjects with laws of their own. From the point of view of consciousness, we can, of course, describe them as objects and even explain them up to a point in the same measure as we can describe and explain a living human being. But then we have to disregard their autonomy. If that is considered, we are compelled to treat them as subjects. In other words, we have to admit that they possess spontaneity and purposiveness, or a kind of consciousness and free will. We observe their behavior and consider their statements. This dual standpoint, which we are forced to adopt towards every relatively independent organism, naturally has a dual result. On the one hand, it tells me that I do to the object, and on the other hand, it tells me what I do to the object, and on the other hand, what it does possibly to me. It is obvious that this unavoidable dualism will create a certain amount of confusion in the minds of my readers, particularly as in what follows, we shall have to do with the archetype of capital D, deity.
Right. And so in terms of the road not taken, I found that poem quite numinous the first time I heard it or saw it. I actually, when I was a senior in high school, my English teacher brought a black and white film of Robert Frost reciting that poem into class, black and white. And I could see the yellow wood immediately, even then, even though the movie was in black and white, I was seeing it in color. It was quite numinous to me, and it still is, 60 years later. And it's all about what we're talking about here in Jungian psychology and what Dr. Jung is talking about in this paragraph, which is duality, that everything has a dual nature, including God. And so, whenever, you probably come up with either ors, 100 times a day. We're problem solving creatures, and your problem comes up and you either solve it, you're either going to solve it or you're not, but it's one of the two. That's the duality. So
well, I totally agree on that. At the same time, I find that in the last several years, I've, as much as possible, tried to dispense with the either or and move to the both and. But the reality is, it's not a dispensing of the either or, because when he says they are spontaneous phenomena which are not subject to our will, and we are therefore justified in ascribing to them a certain autonomy. I think that's the tricky slippery slope when people get disconnected from nature. because nature knows no emotions, just knows weather. And we have inner weather, but we call it emotions. So the disconnect with nature is almost all too easy to have occur with people because they think nature is something different than them. But like he says here, it's simply not subject to our will. And
right. And Robert Frost himself said that he was, I think, traveling in England, and he had been with a friend, and they were talking about poems, and he said he just dashed this one off, and it's always been amazing to him. He wasn't intentionally trying to work with these
right.
philosophical or religious concepts. He was just dashing off a poem. And so it always amused him in later life how that poem took on a life of its own. And, it's really talking about all this. It's a summation of all of this. It just popped out of him as archetypal things do tend to pop out of poets. And he wasn't consciously doing it, so it came from his unconscious. And his once he had this idea of the two roads diverging at this Y, once he had that idea, then the poem basically wrote itself. And, yeah, go ahead.
As I said, that reminds me of Picasso saying, "Inspiration will find you working." And then I remember my dad saying, "No one's going to get a runner's high at 22 miles just sitting on the couch."
Yeah.
So and he said, and it's a fleeting thing. And then after the race, it wears off, and you couldn't have experienced that. And that reminds me of the Robert Frost poem. A lot of these things that are just dashed off, in 15 seconds to a couple of minutes, and they literally just spill out finished, like you found an ancient relic of jewelry or something. And but I think they don't happen that way unless you have that discipline of the ritual of the process of working. And even Rodin, work, always work. But at the same time, he also said patience is also a form of action, and so it's not all work to the bone. So I like your example of Robert Frost just dashing off that poem and it becoming one of his primary, most famous pieces.
Well, and of course, the poem had a life of its own. Okay, and it was unconscious. It was in the Eros. It was in Robert Frost's psyche, right? And or wherever the psyche is, because I don't necessarily these days hold that the psyche is here. The psyche is everywhere, and that poem was out there in the air to be written. It's just so happens that, as you say, Robert Frost was in the business of writing poems, and so he was the one that happened to bring it across the transcendent function and into the conscious mind of everybody that's ever read it. And so we're talking about The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, in case you don't know.
And it's as if he passed through a resonant synchronicity that literally synced up with where he was and with what he was doing. And then there's that consequent artistic, creative sweet spot that what you pour out is a wonderful thing,
right,
without need of further work. And it reminds me of actually the first ink wash I did in college. And I laugh also. I was teaching an advanced martial arts class, and then the teacher was teaching. He was a black belt in his own martial arts school. So he was older than me, but we were in the same position there. But in the class, he was the artist and I was way the student. And I whipped off this woman's face from like an Oil of Olay, old ad. And it was just dot swish, this done. And I'm staring at it. And he comes in and he stands behind me. And I'm obviously at that age waiting for approval, to him to tell me I'm finished, which there's where the real student came in, because he didn't say a word. And he walked all the way around the class. He gets about halfway around and I'm fidgeting and, oh, it must not be finished. I better work on it. And he came back around and he goes, oh my, you gave her acne. And, oh, you just had to touch it, didn't you? He goes, that's the trouble with beauty. You can't not reach out. You just had to touch it. He goes, in the future, when you get to that point, turn your brush around. So you touch it maybe with the blunt wood end, but you keep that brush, it's going to be a tug of war, but oh, you just had to touch it, didn't you? And it was such a beautiful lesson that it was dashed off and done, but I was too novice to understand, to resonate and swim in that feeling.
Mhm.
I still was trying to do something. I was still trying to complete something. And I laugh now, but I was crushed that day. It was like, that's the best piece I'll ever do. And now it's gone. And, all that. So,
Yeah. So there are a couple of comments here. Torp says, happy thinking Bitcoiners Sunday. Right. Okay. Everybody's talking about NFTs these days. So I don't know if you heard this, Jordan, but with the tickets for the Super Bowl, everybody is going to get a Bitcoin, or I'm sorry, an NFT of the minute of the Super Bowl. If they bought, thank you, if they bought a ticket to the Super Bowl. So that's a Bitcoin or a NFT that's not going to have huge value because there'll be 50,000 people in the stadium. And so there'll be 50,000 of those,
but it's like buying a cap. It's a souvenir in a way.
Yeah. And so, 200 years from now, who knows, there might be only one that is still left in captivity and the rest died with the imaginations of the people. But
and the loss of their password. It's like
Deb said, Deb said, well, NFTs are now mainstream because they're doing that.
Right.
And so anyway, Patrick Hollywood says, it is a fun game to be able to play with your own money. Whereas 20 years ago, we were subject to the banks creating our interests, laugh out loud. And then he says, super smart to die hard fans. But what's interesting is the banks creating our interest. We're interested in money. And so it's interesting that interest is, about capturing the imagination, even if you're talking about little green electrons.
Well, it's really interesting there.
Interest.
Yeah, the pun there is wonderful. I mean, the interest of our interest, and what grows on our interest is our interest. I mean, that's a great circular piece. And I mean, 20 years ago, if I said I was a day trader, I would have a financial background. I would have a degree. I would have some kind of pedigree of experience that I learned with someone else. And, in the last couple of years, I don't have that much money. Why do I need a financial advisor? Well, then, that's a problem, but there's I don't need to pay them this much per year. I just need them to auto-populate my account and I can sign in, buy, sell, move, etc. And that's just like going on Facebook or going on Instagram, because everything's in front of you. But because someone for so many decades has plugged that in, it's more like Macintosh. You don't need to know code to use a Mac or an Apple.
Yeah.
And now the same with finances and the interest in nifties, NFTs. It goes the same way. If you can open a file cabinet, if you can find the right person, it's easy.
Right. And so I'm sure that no one who is hearing this video thought that when we were going to be talking about Answer to Job, how
Yeah, gonna make it economic.
how we'd be talking about NFTs, but it is significant. And
Well, it's like,
I'm purposely not going to make 50,000 copy or 50,000 minted NFTs of my poem that I'm doing for my grandson. I am very intentionally having it professionally photographed with high res, so that there'll be a good quality image of it in my NFT. But I'm in the process of creating interest in it right now. So the question is, when I get around to creating this NFT in a week or two, maybe there'll be some interest in that, and interest in Jordan's NFTs from his tarot deck, especially the cards that have the nudes in them. I'm interested.
yeah, there you go. I mean, and it's interesting with all this, the previous paragraph back and forth, and the either or, and both and that we've taken Answer to Job into an economic land. So, I mean, I don't know enough to make a really apt or insightful comparison, but the difference between Keynesian economics and Marxism, I mean, comes to mind, and that how are they really different? And is it the political underpinnings that make them different? I mean, so are they coming to the same thing a different way? But like this whole perspective piece, the rarity of what causes something to be specific, what makes something Keynesian economics, what makes something Marxism. And I do find it interesting that, we're bringing current events into Answer to Job. I mean,
right,
and applying it.
Right. And in terms of those two things, you brought up capitalism and Marxism, communism. They are the same thing in one way, and that is that they're both concepts, imaginal concepts, that allow people who are skilled at manipulating ideas to manipulate the ideas of a population. And our politicians do this all the time. Somewhere I saw recently, I was going into a store or something, and it says, oh, I know, it was an advertisement for Clorox, and it says Clorox kills COVID germs, or Clorox kills COVID. Well, yeah, it does, but you wouldn't want to take from that you should drink it.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. And that's good point. I mean, the whole inject yourself with bleach. Well, it's a corrosive. Don't expect that to go too well.
Yeah, it might kill COVID, but it might kill you as well. Okay, so paragraph 558.
Cool.
We're on Answer to Job, and I think we're on the 6th paragraph of Answer to Job, which is 558, keeping in mind that these paragraph numbers relate to the numbers of paragraphs in volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And so 558. Should any of my readers feel tempted to add an apologetic only, quote unquote, only, to the God image as we perceive them, we would immediately fall foul of experience, which demonstrates beyond any shadow of a doubt the extraordinary numinosity of these images, the tremendous effectiveness, parentheses, mana, tremendous effectiveness of these images is such that they not only give one the feeling of pointing to the ens realismum, but make one
Ons realissimum. Yeah, ons realissimum.
ans realismum, okay. But make one convinced that they actually express it and establish it as a fact. This makes discussion uncommonly difficult, if not impossible. It is, in fact, impossible to demonstrate God's reality to oneself except by using images which have arisen spontaneously or are sanctified by tradition, and whose psychic nature and effects the naive-minded person has never separated from their unknowable metaphysical background. He instantly equates the effective image with the transcendental X to which it points. The seeming justification for this procedure appears self-evident and is not considered a problem so long as the statements of religion are not seriously questioned. But if there is occasion for criticism, then it must be remembered that the image and the statement are psychic processes which are different from their transcendental object. They do not posit it, they merely point to it. In the realm of psychic processes, criticism and discussion are not only permissible, but are unavoidable. Okay, and
Yeah,
so,
that reminds me of when the multiple people come out of Jung's talk and they each were spoken to directly, except they each had a different perspective.
Right, and so how do we, an example of this would be Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, where there's an image of God reaching out, touching man, and putting the spark of life into the human being. And it's a terrific picture, which it has many very interesting features in it that I have not noticed. We've discussed it in our advanced reading group, but there are a couple of features which I'll mention here, which I'm pretty sure there's no one on the YouTube channel will know about. There may be one or two, but in that image, God is wearing a pink dress. That's interesting. And in that image, man is emerging from a womb. There's literally a womb in that painting that's surrounding man. And, so there's two major references to femininity there, which Michelangelo hid in the painting. But, until, I don't know, 5 years ago or whenever I first heard this, and I remember who I heard it from, which is John Jackson, who is our psychiatrist friend, who's one of the organizers of our conference this summer. But John was talking about that image and the fact that there are these references to the feminine in that image that apparently Michelangelo got away with getting them by the Pope.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example, and I'll try to find an image to contribute for next week in that regard, because things like that, one, are fascinating, but also you get I didn't notice that. It was right, because there's a certain beauty in it that's stunning, or I guess as you would say, decapitating. You can just right, kind of instantly lose yourself in it. But I saw an image, it's several weeks ago, where it diagrams across Michelangelo's David, or that painting on the Sistine Chapel with the God and the fingers touching. mimics not only a synapse of neurons, but also at a larger scale, a cross section through the actual brain. And so there's a certain proportion that we're inherently, literally within our head, familiar with too. So there's so many, I mean, the pink dress and then the emerging from the womb, and they all make so much sense.
Yeah, and there's, people thought or think that Muslims were crazy about the objection to the images of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or the idea of doing a painting that included God in it in any way. And Muslim art is really quite numinous, and yet it doesn't include, normally it doesn't include images of people, and there's a reason for that, which is that your image of God and mine might be quite different, and I don't want anybody to put in a Logos road to a picture of their God, because then it's making me think of that image when I think of God, even though that's not my image. In other words, right? And so the whole point and why this, I imagine, and this is only my imagination, I imagine why Muslims have made it article of faith not to do such images, is that they don't want to be canalized. They don't want their psyche to be canalized into somebody else's image. They want their own image of what God is in their own mind.
And that really applies directly with the Islamic art into that last sentence, where in the realm of psychic processes, criticism and discussion are not only permissible, but are unavoidable. And that doesn't only respect that, don't paint God kind of thing, don't speak the ineffable, don't paint the ineffable. It also goes to the dignity of difference of the eye of the beholder. And that there's a respect of me not influencing you with my potential over specificity of the way I see it. And, no ramming this image down anyone's throat so that they're influenced, even if they avoid it, even if they allegedly don't get influenced by it. It's hard not to get influenced by something that you experience. I mean, unless you can hold the two conflicting ideas and still not choose, that's a place where, okay, you can not receive the experience. You can have it, but it's not gonna change your mission. It's not gonna change your concept. But typically it will in some way, like an arrow that's off a 1/16 of an inch and 50 feet. That's fine. You still hit the bullseye, but at a mile, it's started to be off, feet, not even near the target.
Yep. There are something approaching 8 billion of us today, human beings, and every one of them that's old enough to have heard language related to God has an image of God. Well, even if they're an atheist, and because an atheist is still someone who has to have some image of God such that they say, well, it's not that, and I'm not that, right?
Right.
If you're using somebody, an atheist is just saying God isn't what these people are saying, and the problem is that for those people, yes it is, or yes he is, yes she is, and so it doesn't matter, if all 8 billion of us were to create an image of God in poetry and imagery, every one of them would be different. And that's, vive la différence, we're all human beings and we all recognize ourselves as human beings, and yet we're all different. Every single one of us, there's nobody that's the same as anybody else, even identical twins. And
that reminds me of the conversation in the advanced reading group with the closed black vessel, I think I referred to as Lilith, that had the masculine and feminine side. And what just came to mind is the question, is Lilith then the conscious, actionable, real manifestation of the ineffable nothing other of God? So that the original pair really is God and Lilith, which I would have to drop back to probably Shekinah, the original, I think, feminine Godhead, feminine portion of the Godhead. But Lilith would be, in more modern terms, the matron and goddess, as it were, that would then be taking the helm to invoke consciousness through the seduction of the choice of the biting of the apple. I mean, so I think there's a big, and the Holy Ghost in the Trinity, I've read so many places how it's a feminine force. You don't have three dudes, Father, Son, and Holy Casper, the male ghost. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is the feminine, divine, creative agency.
Except when it's masculine.
Except when it's masculine.
Masculine, because
right, and it's
because
both,
the divine energy has to interact with the logos in order to create anything.
That's a wonderful point, and to me, it reminds me of the magician and the high priestess and the tarot. So you get a magician is formless, first spark, and the keywords inception versus the conception, giving form to the formless.
And so I'll go back to my favorite paragraph about this point, which is in this book, The Radiant Sutras, by Lauren Roche. And this is a translation of sacred Hindu texts, but in the introduction, and it's just beautiful. I can only highly recommend this book, The Radiant Sutras. But in the introduction, he really covers the essence of this in one paragraph. And here's what he says. The Bhairava Tantra, which is what he's translating here, is set as a conversation between the goddess, who is the creative power of the universe, and the God, who is the consciousness that permeates everything. Sorry.
I think we have the green electrons in the air, because I had to mute and sneeze earlier, and so I think we have.
I tried to mute myself, but apparently I failed. So
you got it. It was all visual. There was no audio.
All right. So you're hearing
I did that earlier.
Sorry about that, folks. Let me read this sentence once. I'll start this paragraph again, since we were so rudely interrupted by life. The Bhairava Tantra is said as a conversation between the goddess, who is the creative power of the universe, and the God, who is the consciousness that permeates everywhere. For short, they call each other Devi and Bhairava, or Shakti and Shiva. They are lovers and inseparable partners, and one of their favorite places of dwelling is in the human heart.
Yeah. And I love that. Even with the 40,000 brain cells in the human heart, you have 2 atria, 2 ventricles. I mean, there are 4 components. This comes back to the quaternity, and then they both dwell there. I mean, concretely, and then also then not concretely. I mean, it's the dwelling of the feeling of the heart, not only just physiological. Definitely more the feeling too. It gives life to the physiological, literally.
Right. So,
well, and it reminds me, the heart is literally, I mean, when someone says tugging on your heartstrings, the heart is literally suspended. You know, it's not just hanging out like other organs. It's literally in its own kind of hammock, you know,
yeah,
these ropes of tissue coming down to support it.
yeah. So, I think about all the things that have come into consciousness. So if you think about an old scholar's study with covered with walls of books, and that used to really impress me. But since I started to realize that all those words are dead, logos is dead, it's not really alive, then it's really consciousness, and consciousness is in the eros, it's not in the logos at all. And so that logos, all those words and all those books may have run through this guy's psyche at one point, but did he learn anything? No.
Well, yeah, it's, what comes out the other side. I mean, you put a empty can of Play-Doh in a Play-Doh fun factory, and you put whatever template on, and you pull the lever, and then something comes out the other side. The star sausage or whatever it is. But literally, these raw materials of all these books. Great point there, because it's apt to say then, not what did you get from them, what are you going to do with what you got from them?
Yeah.
Or patience or silence is actually an action, another form of action.
And then there's my Turkish novelist's favorite joke: when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way.
Works the same way, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
ignorance is bliss.
And so,
except for the family.
Well, and so the scholar there, I don't care what's in his shelves of books. I care what's in his psyche. What does he know, and how can he bring that into life?
Yes.
And so it used to be, for me, geez, I'd really like to get to the point where I've read all those books, and so I'm so smart as those people. But, no, in most cases, those old professors are not necessarily the smartest people in the world. Hello, Joel. Nice to see you. Welcome. Anyway, we were working on the welcome in Portuguese last week, but then it slipped my mind. So it's a topic for another day.
Yeah, I think we dialed into the discussion. Criticism and discussion are not only permissible, but are unavoidable. The back and forth tennis match of the both and, but there's never a clear winner. It's the process and the sequence of events within the processes that are the important part, and not coming to conclusion. It's coming to action, patience, silence, or volume. I mean,
Right.
what's going to come out of it, even if it's contemplation.
Yeah. So I've got some heavy underlining here, so I'm going to go back and read the last two sentences of my paragraph, and then
excellent.
You can go to the next paragraph. So the last two sentences is, but if there is occasion for criticism, then it must be remembered that the image and the statement are psychic processes which are different from their transcendental object. They do not posit it, they merely point to it. So it means that they're, whenever you're saying something, an image or a statement, an image from an artist or a statement from a logostician, I guess, all we can do is point to something that's in the unconscious. And
Well, and that brings up your Robert Frost.
They do not posit it, they are merely point to it. Yeah, right.
That brings up Robert Frost, where then to add to the road less traveled, the one less taken, you can never travel the same road twice. Both you are different and the road is different,
right.
And so that's that fork in the road of the same path even.
Right. And Jung said it at the end of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He said, "What did I ever do? I stood at the side of a stream and dipped my hat in it." That's
yeah.
all. And so anyway, in the realm of psychic processes, criticism and discussion are not only permissible, but are unavoidable. Okay, your turn, go.
Okay, paragraph 559. In what follows, I shall attempt just such a discussion, such a quote unquote coming to terms with certain religious traditions and ideas. Since I shall be dealing with numinous factors, my feeling is challenged quite as much as my intellect. I cannot therefore write in a coolly objective manner, but must allow my emotional subjectivity to speak if I want to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible, or when I remember the impressions I have received from the doctrines of our faith. I do not write as a biblical scholar, parenthetically, which I am not, but as a layman and physician who has been privileged to see deeply into the psychic life of many people. What I am expressing is, first of all, my own personal view, but I know that I also speak in the name of many who have had similar experiences.
Okay.
Thoughts there?
Well, I think, this is sort of the essence of the whole book, which Dr. Jung wrote this book in 10 days during a time that he was overcome with a fever. Now, that fever may have been psychosomatic because as soon as he finished it, he was well again. Okay, but he was really overtaken with the passion of getting these ideas down on paper that had been ripping through his psyche for at least 50 years and probably longer.
And when he says, I want to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible, and this is a really kind of his sanitized version of, I'm going to go take up for Job. I'm going to show that bully that there are consequences, and in a sense, here comes some fire and brimstone from Jung that actually I think was toned down a bit from editing with the secretary. Is my understanding.
So I was going to go back and read this.
And I think one point quickly there, the subjectivity to speak, if I want to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible, to bring this back to modern current events, all this book burning. Well, if people actually read the whole Bible, they'd be burning that too for the same reasons as those novels. The intensity there is interesting. People can string together quotes and passages from verses, but if those aren't milestone in the moment strung together quotes, then they're taking things out of context and just cherry picking the candy, so to speak.
Right. And so I've been struggling with, for the last 30 years, with Jungian psychology in unprogramming myself from traditional Christianity. And I finally achieved it. I haven't achieved it with the help of some advisor like a psychologist or a theologian. I have achieved it with the help of people like you, Jordan, who and many others who have helped me to see where it is that I'm going. But we really have to unprogram ourselves, because the programming that we've had over the last 2 millennia has left us in a rather stupid cul-de-sac, and we have to start seeing both sides of a picture. I mean, this is why I try to avoid wearing either a green or a red or a blue or a red shirt on this channel, because I would prefer purple, but there are not so many purple shirts worn. So therefore I'm wearing a green, which relates to nature.
Well, I love the anecdotal example of a cul-de-sac, because I think there's a movie in the 80s or 90s, kind of pop culture candy, a really funny movie called The Burbs. And the person who was literally the historian and the psychologist was the postman, because he saw everybody.
Yeah.
And he goes, "Oh, that's not surprisable." He goes, the guy says, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Oh, they live in a cul-de-sac." He said, "What does that have to do with anything?" He goes, "Oh, people go crazy in these cul-de-sacs because there's only one way out."
Yeah. And right. And Justin says, as a writer, I can confirm that struggles with writing can be accompanied by illness or a strong sense of unease, which disappears the moment the text is finished.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, and
kind of squeezing through the birth canal. I mean, in a way, you get pressure, you get literally, you get squeezed, you get pain, and there's basically intense emotional feeling, and that's a real thing presents in the body.
Right. And so Jung had this struggle because he was born into the church. His father was a pastor, and going back 7 generations. So it was really in his DNA, and he had to unprogram himself. And so then we're presented by this letter from Shemina Rowley to her mother, Carrie Baines. Carrie Baines was one of the first disciples of C.G. Jung, earliest disciple. And both of them were quite close to Dr. Jung. And so what she says here is really talking to this issue of deprogramming, and how we must deprogram, and how we must start seeing things in a different way. And so here she says, she's talking about the secretary, Marie Jean Schmidt, who was typing the manuscript of Answer to Job, and she recalled it was blasphemous, quote unquote. But she says in her letter, there is a kind of theological tract he, Jung, has been writing called Antwerp of Job, Answer to Job, in which CG says Job was right and put a lot of good questions, and Yahweh should have answered them. And MJ, Marie Jean Schmidt, said when she typed the first version of this manuscript, the Protestant pastors in her ancestry rose in revolt, and she had a terrible time of it. Evidently, it was very violent and blasphemous in tone, very negative toward Christianity. She was most upset. He has now toned it down, and she thinks before he is ready to publish it, he may do some more. And so when this was published, and still to this day, it's quite a controversial book. And it's obvious that, Mary Jean Schmidt was running into the programming that she had in her lifetime, and her pastoral ancestors. And as we all do, we all face the same issue that we have to get to the bottom of. And Jung literally summed it all up. In the end, he cracked through to the source of all religions. And
I think in his rage there, like you're saying, that fire and brimstone from within about breaking his own chains, and that were fictional because they were subject to what had been put upon him, but he didn't resonate anymore. And you have to bust out of that prison. I mean, when you hear yourself rattle on your own bars, that's the time to realize there are no bars, but it takes a lot to get out of that. And what came to mind while you were expressing that was weekly, my grandfather, who was a Methodist minister for 60 years, and we would talk on the phone after college, and I'd moved away, and he'd say, "So did you go to church on Sunday?" I said, "Sure did. I went to Red Rocks," or "Sure did. I went to Mount Democrat," or, and it was the mountain climbing, hiking was the church. And he'd go, "Well, okay, then closer thee are, going up higher." So but he didn't shame it, but he kept that. I don't think he was trying to put the chain on. There was kind of a same discipline of the ritual where he was providing influence, which in a sense pointing, but then I was taking the normal, post-teenage, adolescent, post-college, still in rebellion, except fortunately, then when I found Jung, I'm like, oh, then I went, oh, thank God. So look at the irony of that. I mean,
right.
And
so we come back now to Lawrence Jaffe's summary of Jung, where he summarized all 20 volumes and all the letters that he ever wrote in one sentence, which I
love
found.
this.
And it is, the purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power which resides in our unconscious. And if you think about it, that's what religions have always done. They've provided the healing power to live your life, and basically to give you an opening to the unconscious. Now, religions are trying to do it in a very rigid, structured way, because they know this is best for you.
There are more of those chains.
And they have plenty of chains, and here's the collection plate too, by the way. But this is what we're getting to in our confluence this summer, because art, psychology, and religion all do the same thing. They bring you close to this healing power, which some people have called God. And this is what we need to start seeing and understanding for ourselves. And so in art, and we're doing this artistically this summer because we want to emphasize the eros, and not the logos of things like painting a portrait. Okay, so the logos of it is the example I gave of one time in our adult education, I took a course in pastel painting, and we were painting a portrait. and with pastels, right? And the teacher comes up behind me and she says, "Oh, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this." And I just turned to her and I said, "No, I don't."
Right.
It's like Picasso saying, "Well, when I was 12 years old, I could paint like Goya. Then I had to learn how to paint like
I think Picasso, yeah.
Right. And so the flaw in our view of art education is that we think we have to teach in a certain logosy way. And so in our adult education classes here in Annapolis at Maryland Hall, very often you'll go into a class and there'll be 40 septuagenarian and octogenarian women sitting in there who are widows typically, and they're trying to learn art to pass the time, and they're being taught to be a camera. They're being taught to take a still life and to see the still life and to replicate that on canvas. But that's not what art is about. And that's the issue. We have cameras for that today. We don't need to replicate a still life at the local adult education class, because if we want a picture of it for our wall, we can simply take a picture today. You probably have a cell phone with you, take a picture, that's it. Now the question is, paint what you feel about this still life. And that gets through this transcendent function from the conscious to the unconscious and brings something up.
It's funny, I had a similar experience when I was in Denver. The first place I lived, the Art Students League was literally 2 blocks away, right around just 2 corners. I mean, so I thought, oh, well, I'll go take a painting class, since I've never painted before, other than these 30 paintings I just did in the last month that just started. Maybe I should learn. And I laugh that I got in there and the woman was sitting in a pose in the middle of the room. And the first thing that the teacher said, "Well, Jordan, where are your brushes?" I was like, "Oh, I don't use brushes. I want to feel the canvas. I have to hear the drum. I tuned them to D. Here, listen, do, do, do." And he's kind of looking around like, I haven't even touched the canvas and I'm already the one he doesn't like in the class. And so then I start painting. Well, everyone's like, "Can you keep it quiet?" Because I'm like, I've got my silk screen gloves on so I don't, get Van Gogh, consume the paint. But he comes back around, and during the break, he's coming back around. Then model comes over. She goes, "I want to see what's happening on all this trouble back here." So she comes around. She goes, "Well, I have beautiful porcelain skin. I love it." I said, "Yeah, it was just too beautiful. I was too struck. So I had to get out of the paralysis. So I changed you to Brazilian and I put a golden earring." I mean, so she's like, "Wow, you changed my race." I said, "It's still you." And he comes around, and I hadn't heard expletives, and he kicked me out of the class, and I was walking home with the biggest smile on my face, but all I remember was that she was too beautiful to paint.
Well, and he didn't have anything to teach you.
Well, yeah, exactly. So what happened is she really was the teacher. That I noted the paralysis, and then was, of course, you're paralyzed in paralysis. You can't move. But how do I get myself out of this beauty trap? And I remember back, you just had to touch it, didn't you? You just had to touch it. Yeah. And I went, just go ahead and start, because I'm not going to find motivation sitting. I'm going to find motivation with action. But
I really relate to the paralysis, because the leading impressionist painter in Maryland is named John Ebersberger, and he did, I was trying to get control of how you do flesh color in paintings, right? Because there's no such thing as flesh color.
Right.
You can't just paint flesh color. And he had done a painting that was for sale in a local art gallery. It was a nude, and it was called Luminescence. And they wanted $19,000 for it at the time. This is about 30 years ago, and it was sold to a man then. And I really wanted to buy this painting. It was just such a numinous painting, but I remember how it did decapitate me to the point where I couldn't, it was so beautiful and so incredible how he had gone about it, that I just wanted to possess it. It was so beautiful. And fortunately or unfortunately, I never found a way to own it. So it still exists here in my psyche as one of my numinous memories, but it did, immobilize me in terms of my in terms of the work I was doing. But then I learned from John, because he teaches at Maryland Hall, not to use brushes.
Yeah.
To just use a palette knife. And so after he taught me that, and taught me the only colors you need. You don't need 1,000 colors on your palette. What you need is 12 colors. You need the primary colors and the secondaries. That's 6, starting with blue, red, and yellow. And that produces green, orange, and whatever, purple. And so you've got 6, and then you select a hot and a cold version of each one. So that gives you 12. That's all you need. Don't buy black, don't use black, and don't use white.
People used to ask me, how do you get such a rich brown? And then how do you get such a chalky brown? What color are you using? I said, I don't buy brown. And
Right.
What do you mean? I said, if I want chalky brown, I want distant foggy brown. It's purple and yellow I mix. But if I want a rich, robust earth brown, red earth, living earth, then I use orange and blue. And the browns were not anywhere near the same family. One was like milk chocolate and one was like dark chocolate in a way.
Right.
But like you said, and I respect use the palette knife, because I just thought about that. What I didn't like the first time I used a brush was it felt disconnected. The brushes were softening the interaction, but I didn't feel the intensity of the connection. Whereas with a palette knife, you're touching, you are connecting. And so me with my fingers and my gloves, there was that percussion of literally embrace and touch. It's both erotic and at the same time it's expressionistic, because you're interacting with the paint.
Right. And so that's the je ne sais quoi, that's the secret sauce between someone who just, is at home, a hobbyist doing a little painting, and a great painter. Okay, it's the difference between a painting, which, I can do paintings, but certain types of paintings that are very fastidious and very logos oriented, and they but they're not satisfying. And what I like is to just take the paint and throw it at the canvas. And when I do that, I get something that's very powerful.
Yeah,
And
and I appreciate that because I didn't have a palette. I would squeeze the tube of the oil paint right onto the canvas.
yeah,
And it's interesting too. I just came to mind. You're bringing up Robert Frost and
mhm,
the poem, "The Road Less Taken," and he dashed it off. Well, and that Jung dashed this off in 10 days. And what's interesting that what I'm expressing is first all of my own personal view.
yeah,
And what's
sure,
interesting in of all these volumes, this is like his version of Robert Frost's poem. You're going to get something very deeply personal that's
right,
also very connected to the collective unconscious.
right. So just to give listeners that may not know what I'm talking about in my own work, I like to do portraits of people, and I did a self-portrait a few years ago. Some of you may not have seen it, so I'm going to share it with you now. I have to first find my Zoom so that I can share it. Where did it go? Am I still online with you?
Yes.
Okay, there I am. I'm hidden. Okay, so I can share the screen now. All right, so for those of you who don't know, this self-portrait of me, I had two photographs of me um, taken while I was in Vietnam, 3 days apart. One was right at the beginning of an operation, and one was 3 days later. And I I liked them both, but I decided I would paint the 3 days later portrait first. And when I completed this painting, I uh, I just couldn't do the other one. I couldn't ever do another self-portrait of me in Vietnam because this portrait actually says everything that I have to say about the Vietnam War in one place, and it's and words diminish it. So here it is. Okay, and there's just the tiniest little bit of this painting which contains the essence of this painting, and that is in the white of my left eye in this painting, which is right here if you can see my cursor.
Mm-hmm.
But just that little bit really captures the essence of everything that I have to say about the Vietnam War. And so when you have said it, I mean, to say it in an Eros way, which is what this um, is so much more powerful than, this picture is worth way more than 1,000 words. You could never complete a logos discussion of it. But
What I love so much about the resonance of that painting is the shadowed out dark right eye and the left eye with the white that's telling the whole story. I mean, I'm not going to try to say this for levity, but I mean, left-handed people are the only ones in their right mind. So, but your left eye is, your right eye, the logos is now covered, and you see the life, you see what this is. I mean, then,
right.
and
And
again,
this
no
was
matter how
not
many words,
conscious. This was
no, not
not
conscious.
conscious. It came directly from my unconscious.
And it's experiential feeling, and that's real. And
Right.
no matter how many, like you said, no matter how many words I could use, it still wouldn't beat the horse to death because it's just endless. But
Right.
I just love that left eye connected to right brained eros artistic connection is telling. That's the narrator, except it needs no words.
Right. Now, here's another portrait that I did. And this one is interesting this is another one. This is a watercolor. And
Mm.
again, the essence is in the color of the left eye, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just by coincidence, I actually never realized that until just now. And I've been looking at this painting for 20 years, but I actually did this painting in like an hour and a half. And it's huge. I think it's 2 by 3 or something like that. It's a great big piece of watercolor paper. And as you see, I did not use any black here. And in the other one, the white of my left eye, and in the other one, the Vietnam one, I think I did use white paint, but
Mm-hmm.
I never.
I have to ask you, eyes are asymmetrical. People don't usually have 2020, 2020. It's like 2015, 2020, 2020, 2030. Is your left eye your stronger eye? And
Yeah, I guess so, because now I mean, it depends on what I'm doing, because I now, in terms of my contacts, have created monovision where my distance eye is my left eye and my close eye is my right.
it's interesting because I had to wear a patch for a year on my left eye. It was a stronger eye because the right eye was weaker, so the muscles weren't developing. And the left eye was 2015, which is better than 2020. The right eye was 2020.
Right.
But to strengthen the right eye, we covered the left eye. But it's interesting. One of the primary examples of this, I see Jeff Bezos. Look at one of his eyes is just wide open, and the other one is just kind of lazy and closed.
Yeah.
And there's this whole different, in a sense, personality of the gesture of the eyes. I'm just curious. Left eye stronger, right eye weaker, where you can see further in a way.
Yeah, Miles is saying, Skip, I'm not blowing smoke, but the second painting has a Mona Lisa impact on me.
Mm.
Yeah, the problem that I had was not that I couldn't paint portraits, but it was that I was too honest. They're too honest, and they are too revealing. And in most cases, people don't want to see that shadow side of themselves because it captures the shadow, right?
Mm. Well, it's interesting. I think the too honest is an interesting way to say it, because I used to say that 100% uncut identity is the definition of intensity. It's too much. But when you have the experience, then you have that it's in a sense too honest, where it's alive and you see it all. And I laugh at people. If some people are like, oh my God, you showed your astrology chart in public. That's like, and like people aren't going to get it. I mean, but I'm at a place with it where I see it differently, and they couldn't see it the same way I do. But there is kind of a nudity in a way, kind of the nudity of the star. It needs no veils, and when you get a painting that expresses both the shadow and the light, you get that.
Yeah. So we've finished the Lectori Bonobo. Is that what it's called here?
Yeah.
We've finished. Yeah.
His intro.
Lectori Benevolo. And so what Jung has said in this, however many it is, 6 paragraphs, is really the whole point of everything is there. And if you listen to last week's session and this week's session, everything that's in Answer to Job is about what we've just been talking about. And and you have to, you know, you have to appreciate what these things do. But the point I was trying to make earlier is that when you come to the confluence, you will not have a logos experience. Okay, the point is that we're going to show people, I would say about 10 other major ways to access their unconscious on a regular basis, And that's where the healing power is. And so, especially for people who have lost their faith, you know, Jung said that he was writing for people who had lost their faith because he says people who have their faith have the charisma of belief. They are taken up in the charisma of belief, whether it's in Christianity or any other religion or anything else. You know, you can believe in an omelet if you want to. So, you know, if you have that charisma of belief, then there's nothing for you. And the churches developed over, you know, and the religion, all the religions developed over maybe 5,000 years, you know, probably going back even longer if we had records of it. But over thousands of years, people have developed, you know, a strategy, you know, these are the wickets. If you follow these wickets, you're going to get connected to the divine, which is, you know, the healing power, which is what's in your unconscious. So we're not talking to those people. If they're happy with what they heard from their priest or their pastor and everything's hunky-dory in church, you know, this isn't for them. This is for people who don't have an access to the healing power. And you will actually experience it so that you'll never forget it in a way that you will never forget.
At the confluence, right?
At the confluence. And, you know, I had an inkling of this last May when I went to Tim's studio the first time. And, you know, I was there only one day, but I said, wow, we've got to do something about this because there's something here. And I couldn't put my finger on it really. But I started to talk to Tim about it. And then we got the 6 of us together in California. And holy smoke, it was already extremely powerful then. And so we've actually been in this confluence consciously since last November. And so we know what we're doing. And, you know, it's going to be, you know, if you're not moved by what you hear in that 4-day period, you're a stone.
Well, you know, and it reminds me of how to have flow without winging it. I mean, there's a preparation piece, but at the same time, it's flow.
Yeah.
What do you have in YouTube there?
Well, Miles says, Skip, do you think your second portrait is your anima captured? Well, my anima can never be captured, but you know, I will say that there's certainly an element of anima there, and you know, it's already saying too much to say anything about it, but you're quite right. You're quite right. And so I guess I have to show this portrait once again so people see that there's more to this portrait than meets the eye, and it's more than I really want to talk about. Okay. This person is a very dear friend of both Debbie's and mine, and I don't dare talk about it beyond that. So for what it's worth, I hope that makes it suitably
I'll reserve comment as well.
arcane.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're
No.
not going to, we're not going
No.
to discuss that.
Mm.
So anyway, okay, so next week we will start Answer to Job in earnest. And I now have to go and rehearse for my role as C.G. Jung, which is going to take me until 7 o'clock tonight from now. And so
And to play this like a good movie series on Netflix or Amazon, to give us a proper cliffhanger to draw people back for next week, the last line of the first paragraph is, "A condition of this sort can only be described as amoral." To be continued.
yeah, it's all of a piece. And I don't know where I lost my YouTube connection here somehow. So
Well, decent timing, 1 minute prior.
yeah. All right. So we'll wrap it up, folks. Have a good week. And I hope I've been sufficiently mysterious so that some people will take a look at the confluence and come and see us in November. Now, wait a minute. Here it is. I see what I've done. Okay. All right. So I'm going to, just because I keep pitching
Hit the link.
I'm going to put the link there again because I keep forgetting to give it to people. So there it is, confluence22.org, and we look forward to seeing you all again. And so peace to everyone, and have a good week.
You too, everybody.
Thanks, Jordan. Terrific.
Thank you, Skip.